Hello, and thank you for joining us for another exciting lesson from the Garden for Health series, supported by the UT Health School of Public Health, Nourish, and the Garden Club of Houston. Today, I'm excited to walk you through how to grow your own vegetables. To get started, I want to share this great quote from Joel Salatin. He's a farmer and advocate of farming in America. The first supermarket supposedly appeared on the American landscape in 1946. That's not very long ago. Until then, where was all the food? Dear folks, the food was in homes, gardens, local fields, and forests. It was near kitchens, near tables, near bedsides. It was in the pantry, the cellar, and the backyard. I really love this quote because it recenters us to where our food comes from. You know, we've become accustomed to shopping in grocery stores where beautifully waxed and symmetrical fruits, vegetables are available to us with really relative ease. We become disconnected from where our food comes from. And I think this is a great reminder that this was only a fairly recent invention, this idea of having food grown and then transported to a central location where we can just shop through it. And then also, too, disconnecting us from the growing process. And I'm sure that's why y'all are here today. You want to reconnect with that, and I really commend that. So let's get started. Let's talk about how to grow your own vegetables. So let's get started. Today we're going to cover why grow your own vegetables, and then I'll tell you how to plan, prep, plant, how to maintain your garden, and then the best part, the harvest time. And I want you to look at the photo that I've included on this slide. Notice that we have 3 generations here growing in the garden. It is very doable for people of all different modalities and backgrounds and ages and health conditions to garden. And this is a great way not only to get physical activity, be outside, get some sunlight and fresh air, but it's also a great way to connect with other people and to connect with the food that will nourish our bodies. So let's talk a little bit more about why grow your own vegetables. So common motivations are that it can be pretty affordable. And, for a packet of seeds, a couple of dollars, for soil and, maybe some containers, or if you're digging it in ground, it just takes a little bit of maintenance, some water, some attention, and then you have your own produce. And that brings me to another motivation, convenience. How nice would it be to have vegetables, herbs, and fruits right outside of your front door? Growing your own vegetables is also a way to beautify your space. So many of these plants are beautiful and they produce beautiful flowers. I really love the squash blossoms in the summer, these bright, big yellow flowers that attract butterflies and bumblebees. We can also minimize our environmental footprint by growing our own vegetables. We decrease the amount of transportation required to ship or move produce grown in California or Mexico to make it to our local grocery store. It's a pretty small footprint if you walk just 10 feet outside of your house. Also, another motivation, no chemical contamination. When you control what's put onto your garden, and especially if you're using an organic system, you really minimize any type of chemical contamination to your food as well as your environment. And growing your own vegetables is a great way to commune with nature. You can go out every day, every couple of days, enjoy the sights of the plants growing from tiny seedlings to full-grown, mature, beautiful plant. And really one of my favorites too is better flavor. When we pick food at the peak harvest, and when it's ripe, it has better flavor. I think that's why the farm to table movement has become so popular over the years. But now I've shared some of the common motivations for myself and for other people. What's your reason for wanting to grow your own vegetables? The first step to successfully growing your own vegetables is to come up with a plan. And at the root of your plan needs to be the types of plants that you and your family like to eat. So think about that. What do you like to eat? What does your family like to eat? What types of vegetables would you want to have on hand or always stocked in your refrigerator, and that you wouldn't have to go to the grocery store to get a couple of times a week or every other week? Now, when planning your vegetable garden, one of the more important factors too to consider is your climate. Temperature is a critical factor when planning your vegetable garden. You want to make sure that you choose varieties of vegetables that are adapted to your specific climate. For instance, if you are in the Houston area while viewing this lesson, you know that it's hot most of the year and it's pretty humid and wet throughout the year as well. So you want to make sure that you choose varieties of vegetables that are well suited to our hot, humid, and wet environment, because that makes sure that you set up your vegetables for the most success in growing. You also want to choose vegetables and grow them during the season that they are best suited. That's where the term of seasonality comes into play. It's not ideal to plant lettuce in the summer because the hot, intense sunlight during long summer days will break down or wilt the delicate lettuce leaves. Now, corn, okra, tomatoes, they have very robust leaves that crave that intense sunlight and long days of it. So we want to make sure that we plan our garden with seasonality in mind. So when is it the best time of year to grow those crops? And I know that we can be a little thrown off base from that concept because in our grocery stores today, we have year-round produce. We see tomatoes every week, so 52 weeks out of the year. So we've kind of lost touch with this concept of seasonality. But I think that's really coming back. And if you start to pay attention to the types of vegetables that are, featured on sale in the produce section, that's often going to give you a hint of what's seasonal. I want to share another thought about climate with you. When we think about plant hardiness, hardiness is, does a plant grow well in the temperature range of an area? If yes, then it's hardy. Mostly, it might be semi-hardy. No, then you might want to plant it indoors or in a greenhouse because it's not going to do very well in the hot and cold extremes of that range. Because if you think about it, where a plant's roots are is where it's bound, and it's going to have to survive whatever environmental conditions it's surrounded by. And a good example or a good thing to think about is frost particularly. That's oftentimes what people think about when they think hardiness. So frost is something that we rarely have to worry about in Houston, but occasionally we'll get a light freeze. And a light freeze is something is when the temperature is 28 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit for a few hours. Our plants are susceptible to damage when they encounter a light freeze, especially if they're not very hardy to that cold temperature range. Now, even more rarely, at least in the Houston area, we get a hard freeze. We might see that more in the northern latitudes or even northern part of Texas. And that's when our temperatures drop to below 25 to 28 degrees Fahrenheit for one or more days. That can cause extreme damage to plants that are not hardy. And there's very few vegetable crops that are hardy to hard freezes. And what we want to do in the case of a frost or a hard freeze, we want to cover them, we want to mulch around their roots, water them, and just protect them generally. And the nice thing about covering them is you kind of trap in any sort of like heat that's coming off of the earth at that time. So you protect them from the worst. And then you just kind of pray and hope that they survive. Here's a really great tool to use when you're planning your vegetable garden. It's a way to determine your plant hardiness zone. Knowing the plant hardiness zone is important when you're choosing the types of vegetable plants you want to plant in your garden. And so you go to the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone map. The URL is at the top of the screen in green. You enter your zip code. I entered in my zip code for the Texas Medical Center. And then it shows you roughly the area in which we're living here. And so Houston is right in the middle of 9A. That's kind of this deep mustard colored area. And so you'll want to remember 9A and use that as a reference when you're choosing plant varieties, because on seed packets, as well as plant stakes and plant guides, they will often say this variety of plant grows best in hardiness zones, say 7B through 9B. If you are in a zone that is not referenced in that range, it might be a little tricky to grow that plant. You can still do it, but just understand that there might be temperatures that will make that plant vulnerable to damage, and you may need to grow it indoors or in a greenhouse, as I mentioned before. I want to revisit this idea of seasonality. So seasonality is the time of year that a plant crop grows best, and it's characterized by the temperature range that often accompanies that time of year, as well as its sunlight exposure. So cool season vegetables are cool season veggies seasonally because they generally grow at lower minimum temperatures, they can tolerate frost, and they don't need as much sunlight. The plants that do best during this time are those that are generally kind of shallow, they have dense root structures. So we see those as cruciferous vegetables like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, root vegetables like beets, radishes, onions, and garlic. My favorite vegetable to grow this time of year in Houston is winter greens like collards, Asian greens, and lettuce. And we can also grow legumes and beans like sugar snap peas, green or English peas, and snow peas. Warm season vegetables are those that we typically plant in May to October, and these plants typically cannot tolerate much of a frost and grow best at a higher temperature range, such as 70 to 90 degrees, and then they have a minimum temperature threshold of 55 to 65. They are generally known for having deep spreading roots. And examples of these are your solanaceous vegetables such as tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, my southern favorites like okra and corn, summer squash like zucchini and yellow squash, and other legumes like southern peas, lima beans, and snap peas. Another way to think of seasonality is, for instance, I identify as kind of a summer girl. I have a minimum temperature threshold of 65, but I can tolerate 110 degrees. I might be sweating, but I can deal with it. I can manage. I'm not going to be found in Alaska or Colorado. I like summer weather. And so just think of it like that. I think we can kind of identify, like, some people are definitely snow bunnies and some people definitely like warmer temperatures. Now that we have an idea of a plan and what types of plants we want to plant, there's a few tools that we're going to need to be successful in our vegetable garden. I would recommend getting a pair of good gardening gloves. I really like the ones that kind of have this vinyl on one side that kind of protects your gloves from getting super wet. And I really like that because I like to dig around in the soil with my gloves. If you're not fond of getting soil on your hands or on your gloves, a trowel or a spade will be a good tool for you. That's useful in turning the soil, digging for transplants. You'll also want to get a water source. I show a watering can here, and that's great if you have just a few container gardens, but you might also be using a water hose and that water hose might be set up to municipal water or a rain collection barrel. You also want to make sure that you have some compost on hand. That's great for adding nutrients to your soil, and you want to have gardening soil or a potting mix to, again, create a fluffy, aerated soil that roots can easily grow into. The next step, now that you've got your tools, is to think about what type of planting system you want to use in your garden. So we have an organic system, which the priority is to nourish the soil and make sure that the soil has all the nutrients and facilitates the growth of beneficial bacteria and fungi that help support strong root growth. And in that way, it really helps support thriving plants. And since you have this thriving, supportive soil ecosystem, there's often fewer pests and disease as well. And in this system, an organic system, we use slow, steady fertilizers such as compost, or we might use 6-2-4 pellet or granular fertilizer. In a non-organic system, the priority is to use chemical fertilizers such as like a commercial fertilizer, to encourage plant growth. So it doesn't really think about encouraging the health of the soil for that plant. You can really kind of develop a dependence on these chemicals, and that can cost a lot more money. And since these ecosystems are kind of imbalanced because you're adding chemicals and they're very strong concentrations of those chemicals, you can often get a lot of bacterial overgrowth. And once you have this ecosystem in balance, there might be more pests, which then means more pesticides, and then that means even more money. So another consideration too is that these high concentrations of chemical fertilizers can become toxic to the soil. And it can also be toxic to your plants. It can burn their roots. It can be toxic to people if they're not properly washed. And overall, it can contaminate the environment. Now, the next step in prepping our garden is thinking about where we want to have our garden. Whether you're planting in a container or an in-ground garden, you want to make sure that your site has adequate sunlight because that's what plants need to grow big and produce the material that we'll eat, such as the leaves, the roots, or the fruits. And we think about adequate sunlight. Full sun is 6 to 8 hours of direct light. Flowering and fruiting vegetables do the best here. So your peppers, corn, okra, eggplant do the best in full sun. And full sun looks like this. It's pretty intense light. And as you can see, the shadows cast by the sun and this cabbage plant are pretty stark. Now, partial shade might also be called dappled sunlight or partially sunny in some directories, and that's usually about 2 to 6 hours of direct light plus dappled or reflected light. Leafy and root vegetables and herbs do well in this type of light, but do have an expectation that the growth might be slower and smaller. Now, there is also a deeply shaded light, and that's usually under a big tree, or maybe there's very little light reflected in the environment, and not many vegetables grow that well. You can grow some leafy greens and herbs, but for the most part, I wouldn't recommend growing your vegetables in a deeply shaded area. Now let's think about preparing our soil. In a container garden, I would recommend starting with a soilless potting mix, not topsoil or your native soil. And this mix will have mostly sphagnum moss or coco coir and may also contain perlite or vermiculite. I would also recommend adding a scoop of compost per 1 square foot of potting mix, and that compost just adds slow release nutrients. This soilless potting mix will encourage root growth because it's light, fluffy, not very dense, and it helps maintain a desired moisture level. You'll want to fertilize every 1 to 3 months by adding 1 inch or so of finished compost as a top dress. So basically you just lay down the compost on the soil surrounding that plant and in your garden. You'll also want to give it a deep watering, and then over time, with rainfall or additional waterings, those nutrients in that compost will percolate through the soil and reach the roots. You'll also want to monitor the moisture in your container garden pretty regularly because container gardens do have a tendency to dry out quickly, and that spells disaster for your water-loving vegetables. Now, soil preparation for in-ground garden is a little bit different. I would recommend, if you haven't done this before, to get your soil tested at a lab. You can send off for soil tests. You can even check online. But what you want to check for is the soil structure. Is it silty, sandy, loamy, or clay type? You also want to check the pH of your soil. Is it really basic? Is it really acidic? Because plants have a desired pH range, which is usually controlled for in our potting mix. You also want to check what kind of nutrients are in the soil. Clay type soils generally hang on to a lot of nutrients, whereas sandy type lose those nutrients with water washing through them. And you also want to check, since these vegetables you're growing for yourself and your family, you want to check that the soil is not contaminated with like heavy metals like arsenic or lead. So don't worry, in-ground gardening is usually perfectly safe, but I usually recommend a soil test to people that want to dig in ground and create a garden there. Now, based on your soil test results, you'll want to doctor up your soil by adding organic amendments to improve that soil quality. And there's several references you can use to find out what types of amendments you'll need, and you can even Google that too based off of your soil test results. And then next, once you have an idea of what your soil is like, you'll want to prepare your planting beds, and that really depends on your space, what you want to grow, and how much you want to dig too. And I would recommend plots that are no wider than 4 feet, because then you're going to have to, walk across it to work on it. It's usually 4 feet and access on both sides, so that way you're not trampling anything. And then digging down a depth of at least 1 foot. But if you are planting anything that has really deep roots, like your summer plants, you'll want to dig even deeper, so maybe about 24 inches. Now, a little bit of advice on how to read seed packets. This is a great resource for you because it contains so much information, and this is great for when you start planting your plants. A seed packet contains a profile of the veggie, what its flavor is like with this arugula here. On the left-hand side, it shows us the veggie flavor profile is robust, peppery, flavorful. It tells us about the sunlight needs. Very clearly, it shows and tells us that it needs full sun, which means 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. And then it also tells us how many days it takes from sprout to when we can harvest it, or its maturity. And the great thing about most of our vegetables is that you can always harvest them even before they come to full maturity. On the back of our seed packets, it also it gives us a lot of similar information. It might give us that information in more greater detail. Like on the backs of most seed packets, it gives you very detailed planting directions. It might reiterate that sunlight needs, the planting depth, how deep you plant those seeds, how often you should thin them out, and when again you can harvest them. And then if you'll see down here, this map of the United States, this is a smaller version of that hardiness map. So again, it's kind of giving us some direction on when is the best time of year for the part of the country that we live in to plant our seeds to make sure that they are growing in their optimal growing conditions. Now, some tips for when you do plant. If you're planting from seed, you'll want to plant following the seed packet directions if you have those, or a rule of thumb that I like to use is 4 to 6 times the seed size. That's the depth that you'll plant. So if you have a tiny 1 millimeter seed like a lettuce seed, you'll generally plant that about 1/4 of an inch deep. I wouldn't plant too much deeper than 1/2 inch for lettuce because then it makes it even harder for the plant to reach the sunlight. So you want to plant it just below the surface. And if you plant transplants, you want to plant them to the depth of that root container that they're in. So if they're growing in a 4-inch pot, you want to plant them 4 inches down. And then with spacing, you want to make sure that the plants are spaced far enough apart that they're able to get enough nutrients and water, because plants are going to compete with each other for these limited resources in the soil. And you also want to prevent overcrowding. You can refer to the seed packet or the plant stake for those recommendations. You also want to think about the arrangement. Most commonly, we plant in a grid system or a row system. Some people have even found success with an offset system, so it's kind of like staggered rows, and that works pretty well as well. So in this slide, we see an example of a container garden, an above ground container garden or a raised bed. And we have a trellis at the top. We have several plants planted. It looks like kale, cabbage, and cauliflower. And then we also have some smaller lettuce plants towards the bottom. I want to show you this because this shows a really easy system of planting. It's called the square foot grid planting. And if you search online, there's tons of plans that can help guide you if you're just starting out. But basically the concept is that you divide your planting space into 1-foot grids, like so. And you can use a string and ruler to create a guide, and it can be temporary or you can keep it up. It can be a good support for some plants too. And then the idea is that you plant one type of plant per space. So you can see that we have like kale in this one square, we have cauliflower in another square. We don't have too much overlap. But then the number of plants that you add to each square kind of depends on the planting space requirements. And so we know that lettuce doesn't need quite as much room as a full-grown cauliflower, so we can actually put a lot of lettuce plants all together in this 1 square foot space. A few maintenance tips for you. I would recommend weeding weekly. I don't think weeds are bad. I know that we often demonize weeds. Get them out of our yard, get them out of our grass. But the reason that we don't like weeds usually is that they take up space and nutrients and water for the plants that we're trying to grow. So some gardening methods do leave weeds alone, and it's up to your preference. I generally just pull the most intrusive weeds. You also want to fertilize one time per every 1 to 3 months, depending on your plant's nutrient requirements. Plants that are in full growth mode, say they're producing a lot of tomatoes, they're going to need more fertilizer because it's taking a lot of nutrients to grow that fruit. And you can fertilize using a 624 organic pellet fertilizer that you just put just below the surface, kind of 4 to 6 inches around the stem of the plant. Or you can also top dress by spreading compost on the surface of the soil as seen here. And you can do that every 1 to 3 months. You also want to prune your plants. You want to remove dead or diseased leaves and branches from your plants. Okay, now it's harvest time. So when is it ready? You might want to reference the seed packet for the maturity date, and you compare that to when you planted it. So what I usually do is I usually put the date that I planted something on the planting stake, and that gives me an idea of how long it's been growing. So if I planted something in on October 1st and it takes 35 days to mature, I know that I'll be ready to harvest in the first week of November. But like I said before, a lot of times we can harvest even before the mature buy date. It might depend on the variety, and also it might depend on how much sunlight you've been getting. If you have a lot of intense sunlight and your plant is growing fast and big, then you can probably harvest earlier. I also like to use the grocery store produce as a guide. I kind of get a better idea of, okay, this is what it looks like and feels like when it's ripe. It's not always the best, but it's something that you can kind of reference. And also when harvesting, something to think about when you're harvesting the plants themselves. For fruit and vegetables, you kind of want to hold just the stem and then tug firmly at that fruit to break it off. For leafy vegetables, as seen in this image, you want to pick just the mature, older leaves that are generally on the outside. You don't want to necessarily pull up the entire plant because it can continue producing for you. I mean, if you're just ready to harvest the whole thing, that's okay to do, but just remember that it can still continue to grow. Now for our root vegetables, how to harvest is you'll essentially hold the plant at the base of the stem near the ground and then just give it a firm upward tug. Now that really works for onions, carrots, garlic, even ginger. For some root vegetables like potatoes, you'll want to carefully dig those up. Woo, we've covered a lot of material today. Let's review the main points of each section to make sure we have the most important ideas down. First, plan out your garden. Choose vegetables that you and your family will eat or might be interested in trying. And also choose vegetables that are well suited to your climate. Use a garden plan template. You can get one online or draw out your own, but have an idea of how you want to plant your space. Next, prep. Choose a spot that receives partial or dappled sunlight, which is about 1 to 2 hours of direct light and then reflected light for the rest of the day, or full sunlight, which is about 6 to 8 hours of intense light. Use low density potting soil mix if you're planting a container garden. And then if you have an in-ground bed, you want to prepare the soil by loosening that dense native soil and make any nutrient corrections by adding organic amendments like compost. Next, you want to plan. Refer to seed packets or plant guides to determine the planting depth and spacing and practice the techniques that we've talked about today. Next, you'll want to maintain your vegetable garden. It'll take 30 to 90 days for most plants to grow, so you want to make sure that your garden remains in good shape while your vegetables are growing. You'll want to regularly remove weeds that compete for nutrients, water, and space, and you'll want to fertilize a couple of times during that growing season by adding 1-inch layer of compost every 1 to 2 to 3 months, depending on how much nutrients that plant is using. Now, finally, the harvest. You can use the maturity date on the seed packets or in the plant guide to estimate when you can harvest. But remember, many plants, especially greens, can be harvested and enjoyed before they're fully mature. Now it's time to practice what we've learned today. Join me in the Holistic Garden, where I'll show you how to start your fall vegetable garden. I'll show you my tips and tricks on how to plant seeds and your transplants for the greatest success. Then join me in the Teaching Kitchen, where I'll show you how to cook your harvest, and I will show you the delicious broccoli 5-spice stir fry and one of my favorites, smoky spice carrots topped with the carrot top chimichurri sauce. Thank you for joining me for another episode in the Garden for Health series. I've loved talking to you about vegetable gardening. Let me know if you have any questions that I can help clarify. If you've started a vegetable garden today or you have one growing, send me pictures. I would love to see it. And also send me your pictures and comments about any of the dishes that I've demonstrated for you today. Until next time, keep growing.